In the dusty archives of the Wisconsin Historical Society, buried among immigration documents and 19th century census records, there exists a file that few researchers dare to open completely. A file marked simply as Richter Case 1873, closed matter. Within those yellowed pages lies one of the most disturbing and extraordinary stories ever documented in American history. A story that challenges everything we believe we know about the capabilities of the human mind, about the limits of observation, and about the terrible price of knowing too much. This is the story of Emma Richter, an 11-year-old girl who could calculate death with the precision of a Swiss watch, and whose extraordinary mathematical mind unveiled secrets so dark that 3 men died to protect them. A family fled in the night, and she herself disappeared without a trace, taking with her knowledge that perhaps should never have been discovered. But before we delve into the terrifying events of the winter of 1873, we need to understand the world in which Emma Richter lived, breathed, and calculated. Imagine, if you can, the cobblestone streets of Milwaukee in the harsh winter of 1873. Snow crunches under worn leather boots, and the air is thick with steam from thousands of chimneys burning coal and wood. The sweet and bitter aroma of fermenting beer mingles with smoke, creating that distinctive fragrance that identified the German neighborhood from miles away. Milwaukee in 1873 was not simply an American city with German immigrants. It was a new Bavaria transplanted to the shores of Lake Michigan, a world within a world where one could live an entire life without speaking a word of English. The breweries dominated the landscape like industrial cathedrals. Schlitz, Pabst, Best, names that were already making the city famous. But it was the dozens of smaller breweries that truly fed the community. Family operations where fathers taught sons the secrets of malting, where recipes were guarded like family treasures, and where German pride was distilled into every barrel. The German Quarter spread like an organized web from downtown Milwaukee toward the lake. 2-story wooden houses lined perfectly straight streets, each with its small backyard where women cultivated the same vegetables their mothers had planted in the Black Forest or Bavaria. The breweries, built of sturdy red brick, rose like fortresses among the residences. Their chimneys released constant columns of white smoke that mixed with the grey clouds of Wisconsin's winter sky. At night, when yellow lights came on in hundreds of windows, the neighborhood looked like an illustration from a Brothers Grimm fairy tale. But like all grim tales, the surface beauty concealed much darker truths. Days began before dawn with the sound of brewery whistles. One long whistle meant the early shift for malting workers, 2 short whistles called the brewers. A sharp, sustained whistle was the signal for barrel workers. Women knew these sounds like musicians know the notes of a symphony. Each whistle told them exactly where their husband was, how much time they had to prepare breakfast, and when to expect him home. In this world of precise routines and predictable patterns, a girl with a mind capable of calculating every movement, every deviation, every subtle change in human behavior, became something far more dangerous than a simple mathematical curiosity. Hinrich and Greta Richter had arrived in Milwaukee in 1861, in the great wave of German immigration that followed the failed revolutions of 1848. Like thousands of others, they had sold everything they owned in Bavaria to buy passage on ships that would take them to America's promised land. Hinrich was a practical man, with large hands and an honest face, who understood the science of fermentation like other men understood farming or carpentry. He had learned the master brewer's trade from his father in Munich, who in turn had learned it from his. In his mind, he wasn't just making beer, he was preserving centuries of German tradition in every barrel. Greta was the type of woman who kept immigrant families together, practical, hard-working, and capable of making 10 cents stretch like $1. Her hands were never still. When she wasn't cooking or cleaning, she was sewing or mending clothes for other families, earning the precious extra cents that kept the Richters above the desperate poverty that stalked so many immigrant families. But neither all of Hinrich's practicality nor all of Greta's determination had prepared them for their daughter Emma. Emma had been born during the Atlantic crossing, in the claustrophobic and pestilent space of 3rd class aboard the steamer Deutsche Hoffnung, German Hope. She came into the world 3 weeks early, during a storm that shook the ship like a toy in the hands of an enraged child. The ship's doctor, an elderly German named Dr. Brenner, had seen hundreds of babies born during ocean crossings, but he had never seen a creature so small, so pale, so silent. Emma didn't cry at birth. She simply opened those enormous grey eyes and seemed to observe. "This child," Dr. Brenner told Greta as he placed the tiny body in her arms, "will either die before we reach America or live to see things the rest of us cannot imagine." Dr. Brenner proved to be more accurate than he could have imagined. During her first years in Milwaukee, Emma seemed like a perfectly normal child, only quieter. While other children ran and shouted in the cobblestone streets, Emma sat in corners, observing with that intensity that would make adults uncomfortable without knowing exactly why. At 2 years old, while other children barely babbled single words, Emma spoke in complete sentences in both German and English. At 3, she could recite from memory entire conversations she had heard days before, reproducing not only the exact words, but also the accents, inflections, even the pauses and breaths of the original speakers. But it was at 4 years old when Emma's abilities became impossible to ignore. It all began with an apparently innocent conversation at the breakfast table. Hinrich was reviewing the week's accounts, muttering numbers while calculating how much they could afford to spend on food. 47 cents for vegetables, he murmured. 23 cents for meat. 15 cents for... 85 cents total, Emma interrupted without looking up from her oatmeal. But you bought meat 3 days in a row last week, which is a deviation from your normal pattern of buying meat every 2 days. That means you spent 12 cents extra. If you maintain the normal pattern, you'll have 73 cents to spend this week. Hinrich dropped his pencil. Greta was left with the spoon halfway to Emma's mouth. Their 4-year-old daughter had just performed complex mathematical calculations in her head, faster than he could do them on paper. But the most disturbing thing wasn't the numbers. It was that Emma had been observing and recording her father's purchasing patterns without anyone noticing. From that moment on, it became evident that Emma wasn't just good with numbers. Numbers obsessed her. She counted everything. Steps from the front door to the brewery, 247 steps by the shortest route, 284 by the route that avoided the muddy puddle at the corner of Water Street. The number of church bell chimes every hour, the exact seconds between whistles from different breweries. But most disturbing was that Emma had begun applying this numerical obsession to human behavior. "Mr. Kruger walks differently on Wednesdays," she told her mother one autumn morning. "Normally he takes 73 centimeter steps, but on Wednesdays they're 68 centimeters. And he looks back every 47 steps instead of every 52. Why do people change their patterns, Mama?" Greta had no answer for that question, but she began to realize that her daughter was observing their neighbors with the same mathematical intensity she applied to everything else. The winter of 1872 to 1873 would be remembered as one of the most brutal in Wisconsin history. Temperatures dropped so extremely that Lake Michigan, for the first time in living memory, froze completely from shore to as far as the eye could see. The breweries struggled to keep their operations running. Water froze in pipes. Yeast became slow and unpredictable in the extreme cold. Workers arrived at their jobs wrapped in every layer of clothing they owned, and still some suffered frostbite on hands and feet. But for Emma, this winter of forced isolation became the perfect laboratory for perfecting her observations. The Richter house on Galena Street had a small window in the kitchen that looked directly onto the German Quarter's main street. During the winter months, when going outside meant risking frostbite, this window became Emma's observation post. Day after day, Emma sat in a wooden chair by that window, with her small leather diary in her hands, recording everything she saw with the precision of a scientist documenting experiments. What Emma didn't understand then was that she was developing skills that would make her the most dangerous person in the German Quarter. Because in a community where everyone had secrets, someone who could detect and predict patterns of human behavior became an existential threat. During those long winter months, Emma began documenting what she called pattern irregularities in her diary. Her notations, written in a mixture of German and English with mathematical precision, revealed a level of observation that would have impressed professional investigators. Day 23 of winter. Mr. Weber deviates from his normal route on Tuesdays by 73 steps. Additional time, 4 minutes, 17 seconds. Destination: Kellner Brewery. Back entrance. Purpose: unknown but constant for 6 consecutive weeks. Day 31 of winter, Mrs. Fisher changes the sequence of hanging laundry when Mr. Fisher works late. Normal pattern: shirts, pants, underwear, socks. Altered pattern: underwear, socks, shirts, pants. Change occurs only when Mr. Fisher absent more than 2 hours. Day 38 of winter. Mr. Steinberg visits the post office with large packages 3 times per week. Estimated weight based on body posture: 2 to 3 kilograms each. Contents: unknown. Frequency: abnormal for reported income. Emma didn't yet understand what these patterns meant, but her mathematical mind was building a map of her entire community's secret behavior, one stone at a time. The morning of the 15th of February, 1873 dawned with a cold that made breath freeze before it could fully leave the lungs. Emma was at her usual post by the window, recording the morning routines of her neighbors, when she noticed something that made her pencil stop over the paper. Johann Dietrich, the brewery worker who lived 3 houses down, was walking to work, but something was terribly wrong with his pattern. Emma had been observing Dietrich for months. He was a man of precise habits. He left his house at exactly 6:47 every morning, walked the same route, taking exactly 244 steps to the brewery door, and always maintained the same constant rhythm. But that morning, Dietrich had left 3 minutes late. His steps were irregular, 251 instead of 244. And most alarmingly, Emma had observed during the past 3 weeks that Dietrich had been drinking from a small brown bottle he kept hidden in his coat. Emma's mathematical mind processed all this information in seconds: the altered patterns, the erratic behavior, the physical signs of deterioration she had been meticulously documenting. Everything pointed to an inevitable conclusion. When Emma turned to her parents that morning and announced with cold mathematical certainty that Johann Dietrich would die at exactly 2:14 the afternoon, she wasn't making a supernatural prediction. She was calculating a probability based on precise observational data. And she was right. The malting room of Kellner Brewery was a vast, humid space where germinated grains dried on enormous wooden platforms. The air was thick with golden dust and the sweet aroma of processed barley. It was a place where men worked in relative silence, with only the occasional sound of shovels scraping against wood and the distant murmur of brewery machinery. Johann Dietrich had been working that morning with increasingly erratic movements. His co-workers noticed he seemed ill, sweating despite the cold, and had taken several swigs from a bottle he kept hidden in his work coat. At 2:13, Dietrich stopped in the middle of turning a pile of malt, bringing his hand to his chest. His eyes widened with terror as he felt his heart begin to beat irregularly. At exactly 2:14, Johann Dietrich collapsed. News of Dietrich's death spread through the German quarter like fire fed by dry wind, but it wasn't his death that terrorized the community. It was the fact that an 11-year-old girl had predicted not only his death, but the exact moment it would occur. In a community where superstition mixed with Catholic faith, where stories of witches and demons formed part of folklore passed down through generations, Emma's precise prediction was interpreted in very different ways. Some, led by elderly Mrs. Brennan, whispered that Emma had the evil eye, that her pale, calculating gaze could bring misfortune to anyone she fixed upon. Others, initially including Father Coller, argued that Emma had been blessed with prophetic gift, a child chosen by God to reveal his will. But there was a third group, a group that grew silently, that realized something far more disturbing. Emma hadn't used magic or divine vision to predict Dietrich's death. She had used observation and mathematical calculation. And if she could calculate one man's death, what else might she be calculating? Emma's precise prediction changed the dynamic in the Richter household in profound and disturbing ways. Hinrich, who had always seen his daughter's mathematical abilities as a blessing that could lead her to a better life, now found himself watching her with a mixture of awe and fear. Greta began to despair when Emma made her clinical observations about the neighbors. The cold, dispassionate way her daughter discussed human tragedy was more frightening than any supernatural explanation. "Emma," Greta asked one evening while preparing dinner, "how did you know about Mr. Dietrich?" Emma looked up from her diary, where she was recording the day's observations. I observed the patterns, Mama. His alcohol consumption had increased by 37% over 17 days, while simultaneously reducing his food intake by approximately 20%. Cardiac stress becomes inevitable under those conditions. I calculated the most likely time of failure based on his age, weight, and observed symptoms. Emma's response, delivered with the same emotional indifference she might use to discuss the weather, filled Greta with a terror she couldn't name. That wasn't the voice of an 11-year-old girl. It was the voice of something that processed human suffering as mathematical data. In the days following Dietrich's death, the Richter family began to experience their first taste of the social isolation that would eventually consume them completely. Conversations stopped when Hinrich entered the brewery's common areas. Wives who had previously greeted Greta with warmth at the market now avoided her, or greeted her with cold, forced politeness. But the most significant change was in behavior toward Emma. Children who had once played near the Richter house now ran to the other side of the street when they saw her. Mothers kept their children closer when Emma appeared in public. What the community didn't understand was that their growing avoidance of Emma only intensified her ability to observe and calculate. Isolated from the normal distractions of social interaction, Emma focused more intensely on the behavior patterns she could observe from her window. And with each passing day, those patterns revealed deeper and more dangerous secrets. March came to Milwaukee with the tentative promise of spring, but also brought the thaw that would reveal secrets that had been buried under winter's snow. For Emma, sitting at her observation post by the kitchen window, this change of season meant new opportunities to study patterns of human behavior. Her diary had become considerably thicker, filled with notations that extended far beyond simple mathematical observations. Emma had begun creating what could only be described as detailed psychological profiles of virtually every adult in her neighborhood. A typical page from Emma's diary in March 1873 read like this. Subject: Anna Weber, estimated age 34, married to Wilhelm Weber, base pattern established. Departure to visit sister Tuesdays and Fridays, 2:30 p.m. observed deviation. Actual route leads to Kellner Brewery, not sister's residence. Average duration of visit 43 minutes. Physical changes observed upon return. Hair disheveled 67% of occasions. Clothing improperly adjusted 54% of occasions. Temporal correlation coincides with Ernst Kellner's extended office hours. Conclusion: extramarital relationship. Probability 94%. But Emma wasn't limiting herself to documenting adultery. Her observations extended to all types of secret behaviors. Subject: Otto Steinberg, estimated age 41, mill employee, anomalous pattern. Post office visits 3 times weekly with large packages. Estimated package weight 2-3 kg based on body posture and loading effort. Probable contents: not personal correspondence. Too heavy correlation with reported income. Inconsistent. Packages represent expense exceeding 15% of estimated salary. Hypothesis: transfer of valuable goods. Purpose: unknown. On the morning of the 20th of March, Emma was making her routine observations when she noticed a convergence of patterns that her mathematical mind immediately processed as significant. "Mama," she said without looking up from her diary, "Mrs. Weber will be discovered tomorrow at 11 the morning." Greta, who was peeling potatoes for dinner, felt her stomach sink. "Emma, you shouldn't." "Her husband will return from the delivery route 47 minutes early," Emma continued with her usual clinical precision. "The horse's limp has worsened by 12% over the last 4 days. This will reduce delivery speed enough so that Wilhelm returns at 11 o'clock instead of 11:47. Mrs. Weber will be in the brewery office with Mr. Kellner at that time." "How can you know about the horse?" asked Hinrich, who had been listening from the doorway. "I count its steps when it passes our house," Emma replied. "On the 1st of March, it favoured its right legs 53% of the time. Today, it was 68%. Tomorrow, the limp will be severe enough to delay the delivery route by 47 minutes. Wilhelm Weber returned from his delivery route exactly 47 minutes early, just as Emma had calculated. His horse had indeed developed a severe limp that had slowed the entire trip. Weber entered the brewery through the main door, but instead of heading to the loading area, decided to speak with Ernst Kellner about the horse problems. He walked directly to Kellner's office. What he found there would confirm Emma's prediction with terrible precision. Anna Weber and Ernst Kellner were in a position that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. The confrontation that followed could be heard from the streets. Kellner ended up with a broken nose and 3 fractured ribs. Anna was beaten so severely she required medical attention. But what was most disturbing to the community wasn't the scandal itself. It was the fact that Emma Richter had predicted every detail with mathematical precision. Emma's second precise prediction transformed the community's whispered fear into open terror. It was no longer possible to dismiss her abilities as coincidence. Twice she had predicted specific events with exact details, and twice she had been right. But what most terrified people wasn't that Emma could predict the future. It was the growing realization that she had been secretly observing and analyzing every aspect of their private lives. What else did she know? What other secrets had she calculated? Questions began to torment every adult in the German quarter. Every infidelity, every small lie, every secret sin suddenly seemed potentially exposed to the calculating eyes of an 11-year-old girl. The Richter family found their social isolation becoming complete. Hinrich noticed that his co-workers avoided casual conversations. Invitations to social events ceased. Even Father Koller, who had initially blessed Emma's gifts, began to seem uncomfortable during his pastoral visits. Hinrich, the priest told him one afternoon after Mass, perhaps it would be better if young Emma spent less time observing the neighbours. But for Emma, the growing isolation only meant more time to perfect her calculations. Her diary expanded day by day with increasingly detailed and often more disturbing observations. And Emma was far from finished with her revelations. Spring came early to Milwaukee in 1873, bringing unusually warm temperatures and dry winds that turned the wooden city into a tinderbox waiting for a spark. For Emma, these climate changes represented new variables to incorporate into her increasingly complex calculations. Her diary now contained sections devoted to what she called environmental risk factors: wind speed and direction, relative humidity, temperatures during different hours of the day, and how these elements affected human behavior. Franz Zimmermann lived alone in a 2-story wooden house 3 blocks from the Richters. His wife Martha had gone to Chicago to visit her sick sister 2 weeks prior, leaving Franz with his personal demons and a house full of liquid temptations. Emma had been observing Zimmermann for months, meticulously documenting his behavioral patterns. Subject: Franz Zimmermann, estimated age 45, brewery worker, base alcohol consumption, 2 to 3 beers per night after work, altered pattern observed since the 1st of April. Consumption increased to 6 to 8 beers plus unidentified substance. Additional substance: clear liquid from bottles labelled lamp oil. Purchase frequency: daily for last 12 days. Quantity: 2 bottles, lamp oil plus 1 bottle whiskey each day. Physical behavior: coordination deteriorated, 23%. Reaction time reduced, 34%. But Emma's most alarming observation about Zimmermann didn't concern his alcohol consumption, but the state of his chimney. Chimney structure: damage observed in mortar between bricks. Smoke emission angle: 7-degree deviation from normal vertical soot deposit pattern. Asymmetric accumulation indicates partial obstruction. Additional risk factor: dry west winds at 15-20 miles per hour predicted for Sunday. Ignition probability: 87%. Probability of spread to adjacent structures: 92%. On Saturday morning, the 26th of April, Emma closed her diary and looked at her parents with that calculating expression that had come to fill them with terror. "There will be a fire at the Zimmermann house tomorrow night," she announced. "It'll begin at exactly 8:47 p.m. and spread to 3 adjacent buildings before the volunteer fire brigade can respond effectively. Mr. Zimmermann will not survive." Hinrich dropped his coffee cup. "Emma, please. How can you say something so terrible?" Emma consulted her diary once more. Mr. Zimmermann has been consuming lamp oil mixed with whiskey for 12 consecutive days. His reflexes and coordination are severely compromised. His chimney structure presents critical failures, and the dry west winds create optimal conditions for fire spread. It is mathematically inevitable. "But Emma," Greta whispered, "how can you know about what Mr. Zimmermann drinks?" "I observe him purchasing the materials at the general store," Emma replied with her usual coldness. 2 bottles of lamp oil and 1 of whiskey each day for 12 days. Lamp oil is highly flammable when consumed. Whiskey reduces inhibitions and response capacity. The combination is lethal. Hinrich faced an impossible decision. If Emma's previous predictions had been correct, Franz Zimmermann would die in a fire the next day. Could he remain silent and allow a man to die when he had the chance to warn him? But if he warned Zimmermann, how would he explain his knowledge without revealing his daughter's disturbing abilities? That night, Hinrich couldn't sleep. He paced through his small house, occasionally glancing toward Zimmermann's house visible through the windows, wrestling with his conscience. At dawn, he made his decision. Hinrich found Franz Zimmermann at Gasthaus Stern, the small German bar where brewery workers often gathered after work. Zimmermann was already drunk despite it being barely 7 p.m., and the smell of lamp oil on his breath confirmed Emma's observations. "Franz," Hinrich said, approaching cautiously, "I need to talk to you about something important." Zimmermann looked up with glassy eyes. "Hinrich, come, drink with me. My dear Martha is in Chicago, and I'm alone with my thoughts." "Franz, you must be very careful with lamps tonight," Hinrich said. I've heard your chimney needs repair." Zimmermann let out a bitter laugh. "My chimney? Is that what worries you? Everyone talks about your little witch and her predictions. Did she send you to warn me?" The reference to Emma as a witch hit Hinrich like a slap. He realized that rumors about his daughter had grown and become distorted far more than he had imagined. "Emma is not a witch," Hinrich said firmly. "She's just a very intelligent girl who notices things." "Notices things?" Zimmermann scoffed. "That demon child can predict death. First it was poor Johann, then the Weber scandal, and now what? Now she says I'm going to die in a fire?" Hinrich didn't answer, but his silence was answer enough. Zimmermann stood up, swaying. "Tell your little devil calculator that Franz Zimmermann will not die by fire or by any other thing her evil numbers might predict." Sunday night came with dry west winds, exactly as Emma had calculated. Franz Zimmermann had returned home at dusk, more drunk than usual and defiant after his encounter with Hinrich. He decided to prove Emma's predictions wrong by being extra careful with the lamps. He checked every lamp in his house, making sure the wicks were properly adjusted and no oil was spilled. But Franz didn't know that the lamp oil he had been drinking for days had saturated his system, making his breath and sweat highly flammable. He didn't know that his compromised coordination would make him stumble into the kitchen table at exactly 8:47. He didn't know that when he fell, the lamp he knocked over would not only set fire to the table, but that the flames would instantly spread to his clothes soaked in oil vapors. At exactly 8:47 p.m., flames erupted from the Zimmermann house like an orange explosion against the night sky. The dry west wind grabbed the flames and hurled them toward adjacent houses with demonic fury. The Bronze House, directly to the east, caught fire first, then the Kohler House to the north. Finally, the Steiner residence to the south completed the square of destruction Emma had predicted. The volunteer fire brigade, composed mainly of brewery workers without formal training, arrived at the scene 23 minutes after the fire began. By then, all 4 houses were completely engulfed in flames. Franz Zimmermann was found in his kitchen, charred beyond recognition. The coroner would later determine he had died from smoke inhalation before the flames reached his body, but that was small comfort to a community terrorized by the prophetic precision of an 11-year-old girl. Emma's prediction of the fire, accurate to the exact minute, transformed the community's fear into absolute panic. It was no longer possible for anyone in the German quarter to ignore or rationalize Emma's abilities. 3 families had lost their homes. A man had died exactly as Emma had predicted. And most frightening of all, Hinrich had been seen talking to Zimmermann the day before, which meant Emma had not only predicted the fire, but had tried to prevent it. If Emma could predict deaths and tragedies with such precision, if she could see patterns no one else could detect, if she could calculate the future with mathematical certainty, what darker secrets might she have discovered? Paranoia spread through the neighborhood like a plague. Every adult began to question what Emma might have observed about their own private lives. Every indiscretion, every lie, every shameful act suddenly seemed potentially exposed to the girl's calculating eyes. The Richter family found their social isolation becoming total and absolute. Hinrich arrived at work to find his work area had been moved to the farthest corner of the brewery. His co-workers avoided all eye contact and conversation. Greta discovered that merchants served her quickly, and without the friendly conversation that had characterized their relationships for years. Children actively ran to the other side of the street when they saw the family approaching. Even Father Koller, who had initially blessed Emma's gifts as divine, began limiting his interactions with the family to formal religious services. But Emma, apparently oblivious to the hysteria surrounding her, continued with her observations and calculations. Her diary grew thicker each day, filled with notations that became increasingly complex and disturbing. And most frightening of all, Emma clearly wasn't finished with her revelations. The first days of May brought Milwaukee the kind of spring beauty that normally lifted spirits after a long winter. Gardens began sprouting with familiar vegetables, trees filled with tender green leaves, and the air became soft and warm. But in the German quarter, the arrival of spring only intensified the sense of terror surrounding Emma Richter and her apparently supernatural calculations. Emma, now completely isolated from normal social interaction, had turned her isolation into an opportunity to further perfect her observational methods. Her diary had evolved from a simple record of behaviors to what could only be described as a complete forensic analysis of her entire community. Margaret Brennan, a 7-year-old widow, had long been one of the most respected figures in the German quarter. Her husband Klaus had died 3 years earlier in a brewery accident, leaving her alone but comfortably situated financially. What no one in the community knew was that Margaret had developed a deep and troubling emotional dependence on Father Koller, the Bavarian priest who had provided comfort during her grief. But Emma knew. Her notations about Margaret Brennan filled several pages of her diary. Subject: Margaret Brennan, age 67, widow, established pattern, Sunday Mass, shopping Tuesday and Friday, social visits Saturday, observed deviation, additional rectory visits Tuesday and Friday, 3:15 p.m. duration, 43 minutes average post, visit behavior, elevated emotional agitation, 73% of occasions, temporal correlation, coincides with Father Koller's extended private prayer periods, observed physical behavior, signs of intense emotional distress when leaving rectory. But Emma had noticed something more disturbing in recent days. Margaret Brennan was showing all the indicators of what Emma classified as life pattern deterioration. On the morning of May 3, Emma was at her usual observation post when she noticed something that made her pencil stop over the paper. Margaret Brennan had left her house at 2:47 p.m. instead of her usual 3:15 p.m. for Tuesday visits. But more alarmingly, instead of heading toward the rectory, Margaret had walked toward the river. Emma carefully observed Margaret's body posture, measuring the length of her steps, noting the irregularity of her breathing, cataloguing the physical signs of extreme distress she had learned to recognize in other observation subjects. Her mathematical mind processed all this information and reached an inevitable conclusion. "Mama," Emma said without looking up from her calculations, "there's something wrong with today's pattern." Greta, who had learned to fear these seemingly casual statements, felt her heart sink. "What do you mean, Emma?" "Mrs. Brennan changed her pattern dramatically," Emma replied, consulting her diary. "For 11 weeks, she has walked to the rectory at exactly 3:15 on Tuesdays. But today she left at 2:47 and walked toward the river. Her behavior indicates significant distress. Her step length decreased by 12%, and her breathing pattern was irregular. This suggests she is planning something final." The clinical way Emma discussed Margaret's apparent suicidal intentions filled Greta with horror. "Emma, you mustn't speak of such things. Mrs. Brennan is a good woman. She would never." "The mathematical probability is 87%, Emma interrupted with the same tone she might use to discuss the weather. "People who dramatically alter established behavioral patterns while showing physical signs of distress typically execute irreversible decisions within 4 hours of pattern change, Mrs. Brennan's pattern changed 43 minutes ago." Greta ran to find Hinrich, who was in the small garden behind the house trying to find some normalcy in the simple act of preparing soil for spring planting. "Hinrich, you must come quickly," Greta gasped. "Emma says Mrs. Brennan is going to hurt herself. We must do something." Hinrich looked at his wife's terrified face and felt the familiar terror that had become his constant companion. They found Emma still sitting by the window, making additional notations in her diary as if she were recording a scientific observation rather than predicting a human tragedy. "Emma, tell me exactly what you observed about Mrs. Brennan." Emma looked up from her calculations. She deviated from her established Tuesday pattern by 28 minutes. Her physical indicators suggested severe emotional distress. Based on historical data about behavioral pattern disruption, the probability of self-harm is 87%, with maximum probability occurring between 5 and 7 this evening. Hinrich made a decision that revealed both his desperation and his growing acceptance of Emma's abilities. He left the house immediately and went to look for Margaret Brennan, following the route toward the river that Emma had indicated. He found her standing on the dock where fishing boats were tied, staring at the dark water with an expression of profound despair. Her cheeks were wet with tears, and her hands trembled as she gripped the dock's railing. "Mrs. Brennan," Hinrich called softly, approaching carefully so as not to startle her, "are you all right?" The elderly woman turned toward him, her eyes red from crying. "Hinrich, what are you doing here?" I was worried about you. You've seemed troubled lately." Margaret's face crumpled. "I can't bear it anymore, Hinrich. The shame, the whispers, the knowledge that everyone knows about my weakness. Father Koller says it's sin, but I can't help what I feel for him. It's better to end this than live with this disgrace." Hinrich realized with growing horror that Emma's observations about Margaret and Father Koller had been accurate, and that the elderly woman was indeed contemplating suicide rather than face scandal. He spent the next 2 hours talking with Margaret, leading her away from the river, convincing her that shame wasn't worth dying for, and that the community's judgment would eventually fade. When Hinrich returned home that evening, he found Emma making final notations in her diary. Mrs. Brennan did not follow through with her plan, she observed clinically. "The intervention changed the probability calculation. I will need to adjust my variables for future predictions involving third-party interference." Hinrich looked at his daughter with disbelief. Emma had observed and calculated a suicide attempt that hadn't yet occurred. And now she was treating his intervention as simply another data point to incorporate into her mathematical models. The realization that his 11-year-old daughter was not only predicting tragic events, but studying human suffering with scientific detachment, filled him with a horror he couldn't name. That night, while Emma slept peacefully in her narrow bed, Hinrich and Greta made a decision that would change their lives forever. They couldn't continue living in Milwaukee. Emma's abilities, whatever they were, had made their life in the German Quarter impossible. But more disturbing was the growing realization that their daughter was losing touch with the emotional reality of the tragedies she predicted. They began making silent plans to leave Wisconsin, to find somewhere Emma could live without being feared, and where her unusual mind could find a different outlet. But Emma wasn't finished with her calculations. The most disturbing revelations were yet to come. As Hinrich lay awake that night, listening to the sounds of the German Quarter settling into sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that his daughter's mathematical mind had discovered secrets that went much deeper than adultery and suicide attempts. The precision of her observations, the clinical way she discussed human tragedy, and the increasing complexity of her calculations all suggested that Emma had been observing and recording far more than anyone realized. And the most frightening part was that she was still calculating. The revelation that would expose the German Quarter's darkest secret came with the deceptive quiet of a seemingly ordinary May morning. Emma had been working on her most complex calculations yet, creating what could only be described as a complete criminal map of her community. During the past weeks, while the Richter family made silent plans for their escape, Emma had been synthesizing months of observations into what her mathematical mind recognized as the most significant pattern she had discovered. Emma's diary had evolved from a simple notebook to a multi-volume forensic investigation document. Its pages contained detailed neighborhood maps marked with secret routes and meeting points, correlation tables connecting seemingly unrelated behaviors, financial analyses based on observations of spending and living standards, psychological profiles of virtually every adult in the community, precise chronologies of suspicious activities dating back more than 2 years. But the most disturbing section of the diary was what Emma had labeled organized criminal conspiracy analysis. "Papa," Emma said, looking up from her diary with those calculating grey eyes that had come to terrorize the entire community. "I need to show you something important. My calculations have revealed a pattern that explains everything." Hinrich, who had been dreading this moment for weeks, reluctantly sat down across from his daughter. Emma opened her diary to a section filled with detailed charts, maps, and numerical sequences that looked more like the work of a professional investigator than an 11-year-old girl. For 26 months, Emma began with her characteristic clinical precision, "I have been observing and recording the behavioral patterns of 43 adults in our community. Initially, I believed the patterns were random variations, but when I analyzed the data systematically, I discovered correlations indicating organized criminal activity." Hinrich felt his blood freeze. "Emma, what are you saying?" Emma consulted her charts with the methodical precision of a mathematics professor. 7 men in our community have been meeting secretly every Wednesday at midnight in the basement of Kellner Brewery. I calculated their movement patterns based on observed deviations from normal behavior, temporal inconsistencies in their declared activities, and physical evidence of their meetings. She pointed to a detailed map of the German quarter marked with symbols and measurements. "Mr. Steinberg tells his wife he works late on Wednesday nights, but leaves the mill at exactly the same time as the other 6 men, and walks to the brewery using a route that avoids main streets. The pattern has been consistent for 26 months, with only 3 exceptions that correlated with illness or family emergencies." The names Emma had marked made Hinrich feel physically ill. Wilhelm Weber, Franz Kellner, Ernst's brother, Hans Zimmermann, Otto Steinberg, Klaus Brennan, until his death 3 months ago, Gustav Wolff, Hermann Kruger. "Emma, how could you possibly know about secret meetings?" "I observe everything, Papa. Every night, every movement, every deviation from established patterns." Emma turned to another page filled with numerical calculations. "The meetings are not the most significant discovery. My calculations indicate these 7 men have been involved in systematic theft from brewery operations, with estimated losses of approximately $47,000 over 26 months. Hinrich's hands began to shake. The sum Emma mentioned represented more money than most families in the German quarter would see in an entire lifetime. "How could you calculate such a thing?" Emma's explanation was delivered with the same mathematical precision she applied to all her observations. "I noticed discrepancies between reported beer production figures and actual production I calculated, based on observed deliveries, purchased ingredients, and waste disposal patterns. The difference indicated systematic theft, but I needed to identify the perpetrators." She pointed to detailed charts tracking the 7 men's behavioral patterns. These individuals all showed consistent patterns of increased spending that didn't correlate with their reported incomes. "Mr. Weber bought new furniture for approximately $300. Mr. Steinberg sent money to relatives in Germany. I observed him at the post office 12 times with packages too large for normal correspondence." The pattern was consistent in all 7 men. Hinrich realized he was looking at evidence of a criminal conspiracy that his 11-year-old daughter had uncovered through her obsessive observations and mathematical analysis. But Emma wasn't finished with her revelations. The theft operation required inside knowledge of brewery security and access to financial records. Emma continued, "My calculations indicated the involvement of someone in management. The patterns pointed to Ernst Kellner himself as the organizer of the theft ring." Emma's final revelation hit Hinrich like a physical blow. Ernst Kellner, the brewery owner who had been gradually freezing them out of the community, was supposedly the mastermind of a major theft operation involving 7 men from their neighborhood. The precision of Emma's analysis, the mathematical certainty of her conclusions, and the detailed evidence she had compiled through months of observation all pointed to a truth that was both incredible and terrifying. "Emma, these are very serious accusations. Are you sure of your calculations?" Emma consulted her diary once more. "The mathematical probability is 96%. But Papa, there's something else. Something that explains why Mr. Kellner has been trying to isolate our family from the community." Hinrich felt his chest tighten with terror. "What do you mean?" "Mr. Kellner knows I observe everything. He has been watching me, watch him. 3 weeks ago, he approached our house twice at night and stayed outside for 17 minutes each time, as if calculating whether I might have discovered his secret. His behavior indicates he suspects I know about the theft operation. The realization that Emma's mathematical abilities had not only uncovered a criminal conspiracy, but had also made her a target filled Hinrich with terror he had never experienced. His daughter, with her obsessive mind for observation and calculation, had revealed secrets that powerful men would kill to protect. Emma closed her diary and looked at her father with those disturbing grey eyes. "Papa, my calculations indicate we are in significant danger. Mr. Kellner and the others cannot allow me to continue making observations. The mathematical probability that they will take action against our family is 84%, with maximum probability occurring within the next 72 hours. Hinrich understood that Emma's final prediction wasn't about fire, suicide, or adultery, but about his own family's survival. Her mathematical mind had uncovered a truth that made their continued existence in Milwaukee impossible, and the men she had exposed wouldn't hesitate to eliminate the only witness who could destroy them all. That night, Hinrich would make a decision that would save his family's lives and change the course of their lives forever. The night of May 1873 was one of the longest in Hinrich Richter's life. After hearing Emma's final revelations about the criminal conspiracy she had discovered, he realized his family was facing an existential threat that required immediate action. With the detailed evidence Emma had compiled in her diary, Hinrich made a decision that could save their lives or condemn them all. He decided to seek help from the only person in Milwaukee he could still trust, Dr. Friedrich Müller. Dr. Müller had maintained a scientific perspective on Emma's abilities when others saw them as supernatural. More importantly, as a physician, he had connections outside the German quarter that could provide the help the family desperately needed. Under cover of darkness, Hinrich cautiously made his way through the silent streets to Dr. Müller's office above the pharmacy on Water Street. The German quarter slept, but Hinrich couldn't shake the feeling that hostile eyes were watching him from dark windows. Dr. Müller answered the urgent knocks at his door with the caution of a man accustomed to nighttime medical emergencies. When he saw Hinrich's terrified face in the lamplight, he immediately invited him in. "Hinrich, what's wrong? Is Emma ill?" "Dr. Müller," Hinrich whispered, "I need you to see something. Something Emma has discovered. Our lives may depend on it." In Dr. Müller's silent office, illuminated only by the flickering light of an oil lamp, Hinrich opened Emma's diary and began explaining the revelations his daughter had meticulously compiled. Dr. Müller, who had previously examined Emma and been impressed by her unusual abilities, now found himself studying evidence of a criminal investigation that rivaled the work of professional detectives. "Hinrich," the doctor whispered as he examined pages filled with calculations, maps, and behavioral analysis, "if what Emma has calculated is true, we're looking at the largest theft operation in Milwaukee's history." Emma's charts showed correlations between the 7 conspirators' behavioral patterns, financial discrepancies in brewery operations, and a level of observational detail that spoke of months of systematic surveillance. "But more importantly," Dr. Müller continued, "if Kellner suspects Emma knows, your family is in mortal danger." Dr. Müller, using his medical connections, agreed to help the Richters escape Milwaukee immediately. Through a medical colleague in Minnesota, he arranged for Hinrich to receive an emergency job offer at a brewery in the distant city of New Ulm, providing cover for their sudden departure. "I must stay here and handle the consequences," Dr. Müller explained, "but you must leave tonight, before Emma's 72-hour prediction can come true." The plan was simple but dangerous. Dr. Müller would provide transportation in his medical carriage, which could pass without question even at late hours. The Richter family would have to pack only the most essential possessions and leave behind the life they had built over 12 years in Milwaukee. Hinrich returned home to find Greta waiting awake, too anxious to sleep. When he explained the situation and escape plan, his wife's face paled, but she nodded with the determination of a woman who understood her family's survival depended on immediate action. Emma, found still awake in her bed with the diary in her hands, received news of their imminent departure with the same calculating calm she applied to everything else. "It's the mathematically correct decision," she observed. "Survival probability increases significantly with geographical distance from identified danger." Even when facing the uprooting of her life, Emma was processing events as variables in an equation. At 2:30 a.m. on May 2, 1873, Dr. Mueller's carriage stopped silently in front of the Richter house on Galena Street. The family had packed their most precious possessions into 2 small trunks: essential clothing, Hinrich's life savings, some photographs, and of course, Emma's diary. As they loaded their belongings, Emma made a final observation that would haunt Hinrich for the rest of his life. "Papa, in approximately 6 months, the theft operation will be discovered by other means. Mr. Kellner will face justice, but 3 of the 7 men will not survive the investigation. The mathematical probabilities are quite clear." Hinrich shuddered as he lifted his daughter into the carriage. Even while fleeing for their lives, Emma was calculating the future consequences of the conspiracy she had uncovered. The carriage rolled through the sleeping streets of Milwaukee's German Quarter for the last time. Dr. Mueller had planned the route carefully, avoiding areas where the conspirators lived and worked. As Milwaukee disappeared into the darkness behind them, Emma sat silently, occasionally making notations in her diary. Her mathematical mind continued processing patterns even in the moment of maximum personal danger. Greta wept silently for the life they were leaving behind. Hinrich clung to hope they would find safety in Minnesota. And Emma calculated the probabilities of their survival with the same cold precision she had applied to every aspect of human experience. When the sun rose over the Wisconsin prairies, the Richter family was many miles from Milwaukee, traveling toward a new life in a place where no one knew Emma's name or feared her extraordinary abilities. But Emma carried with her not only her diary full of calculated secrets, but also a mind that would never stop observing, analyzing, and predicting the hidden patterns of human behavior. The girl who had calculated death, exposed adultery, predicted fire, and uncovered a criminal conspiracy now faced the greatest challenge of all: finding a place in a world that might never fully understand her extraordinary and terrifying gifts. The Richter family arrived in New Ulm, Minnesota, in the 3rd week of May 1873, carrying little more than the clothes on their backs and the terrible secrets contained in Emma's leather diary. New Ulm was a smaller German community than Milwaukee, but it offered something the family desperately needed: anonymity. No one knew Emma's story, no one had heard of her precise predictions, and no one feared her calculating grey eyes. Hinrich found work at Shell Brewery, a family operation founded by German immigrants a decade earlier. His skills as a master brewer were welcome, and for the first time in months, he could work without the weight of suspicious glances and whispered conversations. Greta slowly began rebuilding the domestic routines that had been shattered by Emma's disturbing predictions. But she found it difficult to fully relax, always expecting the next mathematical announcement that could destroy their fragile sense of normalcy. Emma, however, remained Emma. Her mathematical mind continued observing, calculating, and recording patterns of human behavior with the same mechanical precision that had made her predictions both famous and feared in Milwaukee. In New Ulm, Emma began working with Dr. Hermann Weiss, a mathematics professor at the small local college who had become interested in her extraordinary abilities. Dr. Weiss, a German immigrant educated in Berlin, approached Emma's condition from a scientific rather than supernatural perspective. Her mind processes information in ways professional investigators might envy, Dr. Weiss wrote to Dr. Mueller in one of their regular correspondences. But I confess I'm grateful she's far from Milwaukee. The precision of her observations and mathematical certainty of her predictions represent a type of knowledge I fear is too dangerous for any community to possess. In November 1873, Dr. Mueller received a letter from Hinrich containing Emma's final prediction about Milwaukee's theft operation. As she had calculated with mathematical precision, federal investigators had indeed discovered Ernst Kellner's conspiracy. Kellner was arrested and convicted of embezzling more than $50,000 from multiple brewery operations. The scandal sent shockwaves through Milwaukee's brewing industry and resulted in significant reforms in brewery accounting practices. But Emma's more sinister predictions also came true. Wilhelm Weber, who had been Kellner's main accomplice, was found dead in his home under circumstances officially declared suicide, but which many suspected was something far more sinister. Otto Steinberg died within weeks of the investigation's conclusion, apparently in a drunken accident that was too convenient to be believable. Hermann Kruger died of what Dr. Müller diagnosed as a sudden heart attack, but which bore suspicious similarities to symptoms of certain poisons. Emma's mathematical analysis of the criminal conspiracy had been accurate in every detail, including her prediction that not all conspirators would survive the eventual discovery of their crimes. Dr. Müller's final correspondence with the Richter family was written in spring 1874, almost a year after their departure from Milwaukee. In it, he reported that the German quarter had largely returned to normalcy, but that Emma's story continued to circulate in whispered conversations among older residents. He also shared a disturbing development that had emerged during the federal investigation of the brewery theft operation. Government investigators had discovered that Emma's diary, which Hinrich had left with Dr. Müller as evidence, contained mathematical calculations extending far beyond the immediate criminal conspiracy. Emma had apparently been tracking and analyzing behavioral patterns throughout the entire German immigrant community, creating detailed profiles of dozens of families and predicting future events with remarkable accuracy. "Your daughter's mind functions in ways professional investigators might envy," Dr. Müller wrote, "but I confess I'm grateful she's far from Milwaukee. The precision of her observations and mathematical certainty of her predictions represent a type of knowledge I fear is too dangerous for any community to possess." The last mention of Emma Richter in any historical record comes from a brief notation in New Ulm College's mathematics department records from 1875. Professor Hermann Weiss reported that his special student had demonstrated unprecedented abilities in statistical analysis and behavioral prediction, but that her family had decided to relocate once again for personal reasons. After that entry, Emma Richter disappeared from history as completely as she had disappeared from Milwaukee on that dark May night in 1873. What happened to the girl who could calculate human behavior with mathematical precision remains unknown. Some researchers have theorized that families like the Richters, who possessed children with unusual abilities, deliberately maintained their anonymity to protect themselves from both scientific exploitation and community persecution. Emma's story represents one of the few documented cases where such abilities were recorded with sufficient detail to understand their scope and implications. Modern neuroscientists who have studied the case suggest Emma might have suffered from a combination of conditions including savant syndrome, a rare condition where individuals with developmental disabilities demonstrate extraordinary abilities in specific areas, particularly mathematics, memory, or pattern recognition. Autism spectrum disorder, which could explain her intensity of focus, social interaction difficulties, and ability to detect patterns others don't perceive. Hyperthymesia, an extremely rare condition where individuals can remember virtually every day of their lives in extraordinary detail. Emma Richter's case reminds us that the human mind remains one of our greatest enigmas, capable of developing extraordinary abilities that challenge our understanding of intelligence, observation, and prediction. In 1873, Emma's mathematical approach to human behavior was seen as either divine or demonic. But modern science recognizes that rare neurological conditions can indeed create minds that process information in ways that seem almost supernatural to those who don't understand the neurological mechanisms involved. Emma's story also illustrates the inherent danger of knowing too much about others' secrets. Her ability to observe and calculate behavioral patterns made her an existential threat to those who had something to hide. In a community where everyone had secrets, someone who could detect and predict patterns of human behavior became the most dangerous person in the neighborhood. But perhaps the most unsettling lesson from Emma's story is its reminder that the patterns we think we're hiding may be visible to those who know how to look and how to count. In a world where we believe our secrets are safe, where we assume our private behaviors go unnoticed, the existence of minds capable of such precise observation and calculation reminds us that privacy may be nothing more than an illusion. Emma Richter possessed what might be the most terrifying ability of all, the capacity to see through the lies we tell ourselves about how well we hide our darkest truths. And wherever Emma Richter ended up, wherever her family finally found peace, one thing remains certain: her extraordinary mathematical mind continued observing, calculating, and seeing patterns that the rest of us can only hope remain forever hidden. So the next time you think you're keeping a perfect secret, the next time you think no one is watching, the next time you assume your behavioral patterns go unnoticed, Remember Emma Richter. Remember that somewhere there might be eyes watching with the precision of scientific instruments, minds calculating probabilities with mathematical certainty, and memories recording every detail with perfect accuracy. Remember that the patterns we think we hide may be as obvious as mathematical equations to those who know how to observe. And remember that some minds see not only what is, but what will be. Because in Emma Richter's world, there were no secrets. There were only variables in equations that hadn't yet been solved. And she was always calculating. This story is based on fragmentary historical records found in the Wisconsin Historical Society archives. While specific details have been reconstructed from limited evidence, Emma Richter's case represents a documented example of extraordinary cognitive abilities that challenged the understanding of her time. The events described remind us that reality often surpasses fiction, and that the human mind remains capable of achievements we are only beginning to understand. Wherever Emma Richter is now, her story remains as a testament to the terrifying power of knowledge and the price we sometimes must pay for seeing too clearly into the souls of those around us.